Greetings, Kerbonauts! This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 3 of Project Alexandria, and at the end of episode 2, we had left off in 1958. So there are only 3 artificial satellites in orbit right now, but the United States is about to put up a 4th. I had showed a little bit of this at the end of the last episode, so we're going to skip ahead to where we were actually about to be in orbit, because that's where the interesting information about this is. Explorer 3 was launched once again from Cape Canaveral Air Force Base on a repurposed Jupiter C. It carried a cosmic ray detector, micrometeorite detector, plus a tape recorder to save its data so it could transmit it back after each orbit. It was quickly discovered, though, that the satellite was in a tumbling motion, and it only stayed in orbit for 93 days. But during that time, it detected more radiation than anticipated, just like Explorer 1 had. By the way, if you're wondering what happened to Explorer 2, it failed to reach orbit after its 4th stage didn't ignite. Anyway, the detection of that additional radiation is what led them to discover the Van Allen belts. And now back in the Soviet Union, once again from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, launching Sputnik 3 on another modified R7 ICBM on the anniversary of the R7's first flight. This is Object D, the satellite they wanted to launch first, but had delayed and therefore launched Sputnik 1 instead to beat the Americans into space. But now, we're finally launching it. Sputniks 1 and 2 have already fallen from the sky, but that's okay because this is their largest payload yet. It weighed in at over 1,300 kilograms, almost 16 times heavier than Sputnik 1, and loaded with scientific instruments, just like they had wanted to do all along. The list may have included all of these, but I'm not sure because I think I've missed at least one of the instruments that had been on it. Unfortunately for the Soviet Union, the telemetry system or radiation recorder or something like that was not sending back data, and so the Van Allen belts were first discovered by the United States instead of the Soviet Union. The payload was a cone shape, 1.74 meters wide by 3.57 meters long, with almost 1,000 kilograms of science instruments and 400 kilograms of magnesium alloy frame, polished aluminum skin, and high-density silver-zinc chemical batteries. The interior was filled with an inert nitrogen gas, which was to be a standard feature of Soviet satellites, unlike American satellites that were typically open to the vacuum of space. The nitrogen would be circulated by little fans to help maintain proper internal temperatures. Technically, there was another Sputnik 3, but it had failed to reach orbit. The launcher had failed after only 88 seconds, and so a backup second copy of the satellite was launched instead. And this one made it to orbit, officially becoming the Sputnik 3. I've just extended the command radio link antennas off the bottom. The ones coming off the side are the TRAL-D telemetry system antennas. Now, most likely this was in a bit of a spin, like was typical of these spin-stabilized spacecraft. Unfortunately, in KSP, whenever you start to fast forward in warp time, it stops your spin, so I have to keep on spinning them back up again after I've come out of warp time if I want to make them look accurate. Sputnik 3 will remain in orbit for almost a year, witnessing the launch of many other satellites to join it. About a month after its launch, the tumbling Explorer 3 that I launched right before this would de-orbit, and the Americans would launch Explorer 4, keeping the count of birds in the air at 4 for now. So here we have Sputnik 3's launcher. The bottom was still the same as before, although the engines have been getting improved. Actually, I'll scroll down for just a second to show you what's happening with the engines. So I have set them up with these special configurations where I can set it to Sputnik 3 right now, but I also had other versions. We have Sputnik 1 as well as the Vostok L, which is an upcoming mission. Each of these has different performance characteristics, so as I change it, you can see over here the MechJeb window shows the delta V is changing. The original Sputnik mission shows only 9827 vacuum delta V, while Sputnik 3 is up to 9875 because the engines have been improved. If we take a look at the configurations for them, over here you can see this is the default Sputnik engine information, and then I have these alternative configurations, the Vostok L and the Sputnik 3. Different max thrust values, different ISP values for all of them, and it's just as simple as clicking here to cycle through them as I need. Back up here at the top, if we take away the base launcher, which is pretty much the same as the others other than what I just showed you, underneath the cap you can see that we have the payload in there. Pull that away and we can get up nice and close here and see that it has different scientific instruments on the outside of it. This little thing up here is called a MAYAC antenna, and down below we have a flux gate magnetometer and a ZNS fluoroscope. On the outside, like right around in here, these were some solar batteries that theoretically will pick up solar energy and, like solar panels, recharge the batteries that are attached right there as well. Here we have the TRAL-D telemetry antennas, and down at the bottom the command antennas. Now there are a few science instruments that aren't shown around the outside, but it would just be very greebly if we had everything showing, I suppose. On the outside there should be some like ionization vacuum gauges, magnetic vacuum gauges, electrometers, mass spectrometers. Down here, these are some thermal control shutters that could open and close to cool it down as necessary. And down under here would be a micrometeorite detector, as well as a couple other little instruments. Oh, and I just got through showing you all that, but it was actually the wrong one. There's two different Sputniks in here. We have this one that's a little bit smaller, which is the one that I got in the original mod. And then I have this one that I scaled up to be a little bigger, and you can see right there it has the 1327, where the one that originally came in the mod was only a 0.3. I have no idea why, but I buffed that up. This was the real payload right here, the larger one that weighed more. Although it just occurred to me, I don't have any lights on this. It needs more lights. Now that we know that the Van Allen belts exist, Explorer 4 is being sent to analyze them further. 2 launches were planned to continue the investigation, but only this one, Explorer 4, will make it to orbit, as Explorer 5 will later suffer a launch failure. Explorer 4 was actually kept a secret from the public this time, as part of Operation Argus, a series of missile and nuclear tests conducted over the South Atlantic Ocean in 1958. Explorer 4 also tumbled, just like Explorer 3 before it. Explorer 4 stayed in orbit for over a year, although the science telemetry ceased after only about 3 months, when it was believed that the batteries died out. Technically the payload should be spinning right there, but since the camera was tied to the nose of the thing, you'd probably have a seizure if you were to watch it spinning around like that. But we do have it spinning here since it was tumbling once it was finally released. Later that year, ARPA and the DoD would approve $10 million for von Braun and his team to continue development of rocket technology, and less than 2 months later, on October 1st, 1958, the NACA was disbanded and the NASA was created to replace it. Discussions about creating a new agency or administration had already begun back in 1957 with Johnson, and on October 1st, 1958, Eisenhower finally signed the deal. Although he had originally asked for the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, it was later decided that an administration with an administrator would have the greater and needed power than an agency's director would have. Just a week later, NASA would approve the Mercury project to send men into space, and the search was on to decide who the Elite 7 would be that would pilot these crafts for the project. Just a few days later, on the 11th of October 1958, NASA launched its first satellite, Pioneer 1. The intention was to send it into a moon orbit and study magnetic fields and ionizing radiation, cosmic rays, micrometeorites from deeper space and around the moon, that sort of thing. I've just waited several days at high warp to get to my launch window for the moon, and now I'm ready to go, but it's at night, And that's quite interesting since the launch window for NASA was also at 3 o'clock in the morning for Cape Canaveral. I guess this is turning out to be more realistic than I had even planned for it to be. So doing things a little differently for you this time, instead of showing the finished product after the launch, I'm going to show a little of how this was constructed now and then finish the launch later. Step 1 in the process of making a brand new launcher, craft, whatever you want to call it, is I start filtering in the different parts that I'm going to look at to see what it is I want to use, as well as sizing them. And that's done with these plates. I pre-welded 5 plates together into these long 5x1 beams, and they're 1 meter by 1 meter, so that makes it 5 by 1 meters for the whole thing. And then I go and I look up what the size of the craft is supposed to be. So in this particular instance, I saw that the Pioneer 1 is launched on a Thor Able. That means 27 meters long, so obviously I'm going to get 5 plates for the 5x5 25, and then 1 more plate, which I'll put a little marker 2 meters up on it, and that'll give me the full 27 meters I'm looking for. And then I can just build things from the bottom up with this as my guideline, like my ruler. I also have to decide whether the payload is going to be built or used. And in this case, there's a bunch of US probes that are already available. So rather than building them myself, since I have so many things I need to do anyway, in some cases I'm just going to go ahead and use the probes that are already available. They might not be the right size or mass, however. In this instance, it definitely is not the right mass. It was way too heavy. And at the same time, strangely enough, it was way too small. So I've set a panel to the proper dimensions, and I can use that as a guide to get the payload to the right diameter. And then I'll just change the config file to make it have the right mass. Now, the second stage of this is supposed to be based on the Vanguard second stage. So since I already have a Vanguard rocket, I have just loaded that up. So I'm trying to figure out how to repurpose the Vanguard to be able to launch the Pioneer. I also need to come up with some kind of engine for the first stage and size that appropriately. I have the diameter of what the lower stage engine should be, so if I use a panel, once again I can scale it properly by looking at that. It works a lot better to completely reload KSP after making several changes rather than trying to reload the database, which can be a little glitchy sometimes. So I'll do that, I'll make several changes, then I'll load it back up again, and while that's happening, then I might oftentimes go and play in some other window, like in Project Odyssey, while I'm waiting for Alexandria to load back up. The second stage still has the same fuel tanks that it did when it was the Vanguard, but by this point I have gone into a Microsoft Paint and thrown together a little texture of my own here for the upper stage fuel tanks to make it look a little bit more like the Pioneer launcher. Also at this point, the payload is still upside down because I didn't realize at this point that whoever made that probe made it upside down. The retro rocket is supposed to be on the top, and the little antenna there is supposed to be off the bottom, the way that it was launched by NASA and the US Air Force. Next up is my lower stage, which is supposed to be completely different from the Vanguard launcher. This one is a Thor lower stage. The upper stage was called Able. That's why the whole thing was called Thor Able. And then I guess there's a third stage because there's a solid booster up inside the fairing section. And perhaps we might even call the payload stage 4 in a way. It has a solid booster that it's going to, a couple solid boosters, a little collection of 8 solids that are going to orient it properly and get it into the right trajectory to intercept the moon, and then the solid retro booster to capture its orbit at the moon. Since ultimately that is our goal, it's to go into an orbit. I ended up deciding that I wanted to have some customized textures for the lower fuel tanks as well, so I went back to Paint and I set myself something up for those by looking at images online and figuring out how that was supposed to look, and then come back in here after a reload and cycle through finding the right texture and getting those on the right fuel tanks there. I was also ready to finalize the scaling on the engine for stage 1. Now that I have the lower fuel tank, I can figure out exactly where I need it so it doesn't have any incorrect clipping or anything like that. As I get closer to having a proper structure, just the proper dimensions of everything, then I have to start worrying a little bit more about mass values and delta V's and fuel quantities and engine ISPs and all that good stuff. And that's where lots of documentation comes in. Wiki pages, astronautics website, Excel spreadsheet making, and after all of that, I can work on the actual mass values. Here's where it was at the first prototype before the masses were really set and before all the dimensions were completely locked down. So earlier, I sort of glossed over the formation of NASA, but obviously forming NASA was a pretty big deal, since they've overseen every major US spaceflight since. Also, after the National Aeronautics and Space Act was passed on July 29th of 1958, and then NASA's official operations starting about a month later, Eisenhower was sending a message that this was a distinctly civilian operation and not military. Military operations would remain with the organization known as ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. NASA was started with an annual budget of $100 million, thousands of employees, test facilities, laboratories, and later in December gained control of JPL from California. Meanwhile, in the VAB, you can see that I'm still working on tweaking the dimensions of the launcher, the sizes of the fuel tanks, the amount of fuel, what the utilization is of the fuel tanks. I've made another modification to the textures on the fuel tanks as well to get that lower stage a little bit more accurate in its paint job. Later, I also thicken up the USAF letters so that they show up better when I'm launching the vehicle and further away, because otherwise they were getting kind of too thin. And then I decide that I'm really close now, so it's time to take it out and give it the first simulated launch to see how it's doing, how it's flying, whether there are any visual glitches. And as it turns out, the exhaust coming out the bottom wasn't quite what I wanted. The smoke wasn't what I wanted either, so I began modifying those, trying to get the flames a little bigger, a little longer, the smoke a little closer to the flames, and doing lots of little tweaks like that using hot rockets and the smoke screen mod. Attitude control was a little bit weak right here, so it started to go too much to the side. So I decided to cheat it up into orbit and put on the infinite fuel just so I could continue working on the hot rocket's flame coming out. It's just a simulated launch anyway, so why not? Then it was back to the VAB to continue working on the third stage because the solid rocket booster for that wasn't set correctly for the thrust and ISP values. I had to add a new config to it to be the Thor Able config, but still wanted to be able to keep the Vanguard config on there. And then since I had already noticed that the SRB was wrong for that third stage, I decided it would probably be a good idea if I went and checked on the payload itself to make sure that those values were set correctly, and that's when I found the picture that indicated that this thing had been upside down. So I had to work on setting up nodes and the decoupler and everything else that goes along with this in order to be able to flip it upside down and have it be oriented correctly for the launch. And while I was here, I decided to get the fairing a little tighter to the payload because in that same picture, that indicated that there just wasn't that much space between the top of the payload and the top of the fairing. So one of the interesting things about working here in Real Solar System is when you're going out of Baikonur or Cape Canaveral, which are not along the equator like your launch site is when you're in regular KSP, you have to add that to the fact that you are also targeting things like in the case of the moon, inclined orbits. And then if you add to that trying to do a direct ascent launch like in Pioneer, it becomes really challenging to target that and get the right launch window, and definitely gives new meaning to what it means to be a rocket scientist. Well, we're working on the next simulated launch here, and you can see that the first stage engine didn't have any flames coming out of it. That turned out to be a glitch in the config file. And then the second stage engines had the smoke coming out a little bit too high. That actually turned out to be okay because normally this stage would be going a lot faster than it's going when we activated it here in the staging test. If this had been going much faster like it's supposed to, the smoke would have been coming out of the right location. One more stop in the VAB, and then it's back out onto the pad, this time closer to the proper launch window in the early morning to give it one last simulated launch. Since I'm currently eyeballing my approach and I'm not really using math to figure out when to launch, what I've done is set up a little teeny probe core type thing that I've renamed to be my moon target, and I've set it up as a lander so that I can easily filter it in and out only when I want to see it. And it's set to the same exact inclination in orbit as the moon, but much, much closer to Kerbin. That allows me to see when the launch window is coming up, when I'm going underneath the orbit of the moon, much easier since the moon is so far away, relatively speaking, to what it's like in stock. And for that matter, when you're going to Minmus, which is the only locally inclined target anyway, it's not really that much different from the equator, so you almost don't even need to worry about it. Anyway, this simulation showed that I was having a lot of trouble keeping it going in the direction I wanted. The attitude control still needs a little bit of work, but after that, I think it's ready to go. So after watching it exploding a little bit and falling to pieces and the payload sort of scooting off all by itself, I went back to the VAB, made one more change, reloaded KSP, and off we went again for the real thing. And that takes us back to about 10 minutes ago when we were looking at this, the real Pioneer 1 launch. It's the 11th of October 1958 and has about 667 kilonewtons of sea level thrust, and an ISP around only 248 is propelling our 38 kilogram payload toward the moon. If all goes well, in a couple days we'll be orbiting the moon and relaying back valuable scientific information from space beyond the Van Allen radiation belts. Also, the trip itself will provide scientific information since we'll need to pass through those radiation belts along the way, and that alone will be valuable. As it turns out, we're not going to make it, so we'll be going through those belts twice, once on the way there and once on the way back. A programming error resulted in an incorrect burnout velocity and angle, resulting in a ballistic trajectory, and a re-entry over the South Pacific 2 days later. Stages 1 and 2 are done and both have decoupled, and 3 has just burned out as well, and this is how far we made it. You can see it's still really, really far away from the moon. It's about 114,000 kilometers. The moon is 384,000 kilometers. So pretty much we only made it roughly a third of the way. It isn't completely done yet, but nothing it can do from this point will be able to send it far enough, fast enough in order to get where it needs to in order to maintain an orbit at the moon. 8 little solids on the top would reorient it into the right trajectory so that the solid booster, when it gets to the moon, would be angled correctly had we been able to get there, that is. So I'm showing how those would fire right here. After exhausted, those 8 little boosters would get decoupled and jettisoned. Once this is done, presumably that little solid that's on the bottom right would have been angled correctly so that it's already pointing in a retrograde position relative to the moon so that when it gets there it can just fire up and grab its orbit. 1 month later, Pioneer 2 tried to get to the moon again, but the third stage failed to ignite, and it came back and re-entered as well. Another month after that, a totally different payload for Pioneer 3 was ready to launch. The reason it was a different payload is Pioneer 3 was essentially being done by a whole different group. It was all NASA now, but it hadn't started that way. NASA was brand new, and these Pioneer missions were being done, one by the US Air Force and one by the US Army. The Pioneer 1 and 2 payloads were Air Force, and that's why they were on the Thor Able launchers, while Pioneer 3 was the ABMA, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, and thus on a Juno 2 rocket in coordination with JPL. NASA decided to call them all Pioneer missions since they were all geared toward planetary exploration. I'm sure there was a bit of a rivalry between the Army and Air Force on these though, partially because there's always a bit of a rivalry between the US military branches about who's better. No doubt there were mixed emotions about Pioneers 1 and 2 failing. Sure, everyone wanted to see the US reach the moon before the Soviet Union, but at the same time, I bet the Army was excited to have their shot at the moon, where there was still a chance to be the first, because the Army had claimed they were pioneers in space after launching Explorer. So the Air Force said to themselves, let's call this mission Pioneer, as if to indicate who the real pioneers in space were. Unfortunately, none of them made it there. But hold that thought for another episode, because the story of Pioneer isn't over yet. The Air Force had the first 2 cracks, the Army's trying now. Who's going to be the first one? Well, you can see here that the lower stage has decoupled and the nose cone is drifting away. The instrument section and the payload would coast a bit before the solid boosters that were the same ones that had been used to launch Explorer would fire up and start that payload heading toward the moon. Just like with Explorer, there were solid boosters in a ring in order to propel it initially. Those would decouple and 3 more would fire off, sliding out from inside the ring of the first ones. Once those were exhausted, 5 to 6 seconds later, then 1 solid would decouple and fire up. Then ultimately we would be left with the Pioneer 3 payload. But the first stage burn was almost 4 seconds too short, so it didn't have enough thrust to propel it all the way to the moon and past it like it was supposed to. Instead, we had a ballistic trajectory and later a re-entry and a burn up over Africa. These little weights that I'm extending right here were intended to slow down the angular momentum of the payload after it had decoupled, because when it was launching it was spinning really, really fast. But if you extend something out, just like an ice skater, when they put their arms out they go slower, by extending out these little weights on wires, it slowed down the spin. Anyway, it wasn't a total loss. By now, we were well aware of the Van Allen radiation belts, and this mission was able to analyze them further, just like Explorer 1 had done. So, since this was yet another launcher, we'll head into the VAB to take a new look at this one. Starting down here from the bottom, we can see that I have placed hidden inside there the engine connector there, some of the propulsion system, which actually this would be quite large. It would go up all through this whole thing in here. Also down at the bottom there were some little retro boosters to help with the decoupling of the first stage to make sure it separated nicely. Speaking of the first stage, you can see that I've created some new textures again. I wanted to have something that looked like the picture I had seen of this, and so I put together a little NASA thing here with the 2 little black dots, which I believe are to help them from the ground identify how fast it's rotating. But that's just my guess, because that's something I've seen before in these launchers. Those black lines, black and white lines that would be on some of the earlier launches like V2s and stuff, they put those on there so that they could identify easily from the ground whether it was spinning. Anyway, if we pull off these bottom sections here, that would be the lowest stage, decoupling and leaving the avionics, which you can see hiding up in there. And right above the avionics section, underneath the nose cone and behind this wall, we had the same payload boosters that we were using previously on Explorer. The multiple baby sergeants here, and then the one right there, and then the payload at the top. Just a tiny little, almost 6 kilogram payload. Before we continue, here's a quick look at everything we've done so far, starting with Goddard's rocket in the V2 and working our way all the way up to 1958. Well, we're just about into 1959. The last launch of the episode is going to be the last launch of the year. On the 18th of December 1958, the United States used the body of an Atlas ICBM to act as a communications relay satellite. They called it SCORE, for Signal Communications by Orbiting Relay Equipment. It was the first satellite to test communications relay in space, and the first demonstration of the Atlas as a successful launch vehicle. The Atlas, of course, was designed to launch nuclear warheads. Since there was a concern over whether the mission would even succeed, and because the president wanted to limit exposure of US failures, flight details were kept a closely guarded secret until it was in orbit. Very few people knew the mission existed, and of those, very few knew all the details. The media was successfully kept out of the loop until it was officially revealed. Well, we are halfway to orbit, so let's take a quick look at it in the VAB before we finish it out. Very appropriately, you can see at the bottom, I am using the real Atlas launch clamp. Since this is an Atlas after all, it totally makes sense that that's what I'd have down here at the bottom. I had 4 of those. And then this one supplies liquid oxygen to it because there's a boil off rate to the liquid oxygen when it's just kind of hanging around. So it's not very fast, but that makes sure that it stays topped off before we actually launch. Not a huge number of parts on this one. Right here on the sides, you can see that there are a couple vernier rockets, one on each side. Those are what have a tremendous amount of gimbal and provide that attitude control during the initial takeoff. And down at the bottom, we have a couple booster engines down here on this piece that actually comes off. You can see this slides off, and it's intended to drop off partway through the orbit once they're no longer needed. You can see here these engines have the majority of the thrust. 667 each at sea level, and that of course goes up as it goes into the vacuum. So between the 2 of those on the outside, compared to this one that's in here in the middle, with only 245 at sea level, that's where all of the initial liftoff thrust is coming from for sure. And on top of that, I believe that this engine isn't run at its maximum power during takeoff. The ISP is a little more designed, see here 309, it's a little more designed for being up in vacuum, with only a 215 compared to this engine over here being a 248 at sea level instead and a 282 in vacuum. Very clearly, if you had your choice, you're going to run this sustainer engine that's in the middle in a vacuum and not at sea level like these. So that's exactly what I think they did, is they ran it a little lower. I set my thrust limiter at 40. That gave me a lift-off thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.3. Then after some altitude, this one will drop off and this one picks up at full power. And by then the thrust is going to be a little bit higher as well, because as it gets close to the 309, that 245 will have advanced up considerably from the 215 at ISP at sea level. Probably around 363 give or take kilonewtons of thrust. Depending upon what source you read, those booster engines that were on the sides that dropped off, those would go for about 2 minutes, a little longer than 2 minutes, and then that would drop off, and then this one would go for the next 3 minutes. Although ultimately that one cuts off too, and the vernier rockets are what fine-tune its orbit that it's looking for, because remember, this is an ICBM when we're not using it to launch a satellite like we're doing here. And as an ICBM, we need to drop it exactly where we want in order to blow up whatever city it's targeting. So by using those vernier rockets, they get very fine control over exactly what it's going to do, its trajectory, and then they can drop it exactly where they want it to come down. So along the outside of it, as always, more lights, because everything looks better in orbit with lights. And that brings us to the few parts here at the top. We have our nose cone that currently isn't really doing much since we don't have any warheads in here. We have our avionics up in that section and all through this section up in here. And that is basically it. So let's go finish off this flight. And there goes the booster engine cut off and dropping away of that whole lower section that weighed about 3,000 kilograms, so it's nice to get that mass off of the rocket since we don't need it anymore. We've gone to full power on the sustainer engine, and this will be the one that puts us into our final orbit. A shortwave radio on board the satellite allowed transmitting messages as well as testing if this was even a viable method of relaying communications, because at this time it was not 100% clear if anything about the atmosphere or space would prevent such messages. The batteries lasted 12 days, which was plenty of time to gather valuable scientific data. A couple weeks after that, it finally decayed and re-entered. Bill Kerman would be happy to know that the payload was fully redundant too. There were 2 antennae for sending, 2 for receiving, and 2 recorders for storing messages. And that's a good thing, since one of them did fail during the 12 days. Well, you can see I've shut down the main engine and now it's vernier time. Now this orbit turns out to be really good. This is supposed to go into a 185 kilometer by 1,484 kilometer orbit. The inclination is a little bit off, but check out as I cut off the vernier rockets right here. I did it as my perigee was just crossing over the 185 kilometers, and I'm only a couple hundred kilometers off from having the perfect apogee. I'm definitely getting better at launching these real solar system flights into the proper orbits. Got to work on the inclination a little bit, but really close. And although the irony isn't very subtle on this, using an ICBM to send a message of peace, that's exactly what the president did over the holidays.
This is the President of the United States speaking. Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space. My message is a simple one. Through this unique means, I convey to you and to all mankind America's wish for peace on earth and goodwill toward men everywhere.
Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbinauts.